When time continues forward without slowing down, when decisions are made and lives resume elsewhere, and when it becomes clear that nothing pauses to wait, what happens inside a person when he realizes that the world does not stop moving, even while he remains behind? At first, the realization did not arrive as loss, because loss implies something taken away, and nothing had been taken, only left behind as time continued forward without adjusting its pace. The men sensed it gradually, through fragments of information, subtle changes in tone, and the quiet certainty that life elsewhere had resumed its rhythm without waiting for their return. There were no announcements that marked this shift, no clear moment when the world declared itself finished with waiting, leaving the understanding to form slowly in the background of daily routine. News arrived already outdated, carrying outcomes rather than possibilities, describing decisions that had already settled into consequence, leaving no space for anticipation or response. What unsettled the men was not the content of what they heard, but the distance embedded in it, the feeling that events were no longer unfolding in real time for them. The world beyond the wire did not feel hostile or unreachable, but active, occupied with its own movement, progressing without reference to those who remained still. The men began to sense that time outside moved differently, measured by change and transition, while time inside continued by repetition and endurance. This difference did not provoke urgency, because urgency depends on the belief that action can still alter outcome, and that belief had weakened under long confinement. Instead, it produced a quiet awareness that the world had resumed its direction without synchronizing itself to their presence. The men did not feel forgotten in a dramatic sense, because forgetting implies intention, and what they experienced was indifference shaped by momentum rather than choice. Life elsewhere simply continued, filling the space that waiting had once occupied, leaving no gap that required them to return. The absence of pause was what made the realization complete, because pause implies consideration, and there was none, only continuation. The men noticed that references to their situation no longer appeared in what they heard, not because it was denied, but because it no longer influenced the direction of events. The world had not rejected them, nor had it acknowledged them. It had simply proceeded as though their absence required no adjustment. This understanding did not arrive as despair, because despair assumes expectation of reunion or restoration, and those expectations had already softened. What replaced expectation was a quiet recalibration of scale, a recognition that their lives now unfolded on a smaller, contained timeline. The men adjusted by narrowing their attention inward, focusing on what remained within reach rather than on what moved beyond it. They found it easier to manage the present than to measure themselves against a world that no longer aligned with their pace. The idea that the world might wait had once provided comfort, a belief that absence was temporary and that return would restore alignment. As that belief faded, alignment itself lost relevance, because relevance depends on shared movement, and shared movement had ended. The men did not feel pushed aside, because pushing implies force, and no force had been applied, only the steady pull of time moving elsewhere. They experienced instead a gentle displacement, as though they had stepped off a path that continued without them. The world's refusal to slow down did not feel cruel, because cruelty requires intent, and intent was absent from this movement. It felt natural, almost inevitable, that life would continue where it could, filling spaces left open by absence. This inevitability made resistance unnecessary, because resisting momentum rarely alters its course. The men noticed that even their own thoughts began to adjust, releasing the assumption that their return was required for things to feel complete. Completion had already occurred elsewhere, forming without them. settling into a shape that no longer included their presence. This awareness altered how they understood their own waiting, because waiting implies an endpoint, and endpoints now felt disconnected from what was happening beyond the wire. Waiting became less about return and more about continuation, a way of existing while time passed without reference. The men adapted by reducing the emotional weight assigned to the outside world, allowing it to exist without demanding engagement. This reduction did not feel like withdrawal, because withdrawal implies refusal, and here there was none, only acceptance of misalignment. The world continued forward, and the men remained where they were, not opposed by history, but bypassed by it. By the end of this phase, the understanding had settled quietly, not as a conclusion, but as a condition that the world would not slow down, would not pause, and would not wait, and that their lives would now unfold within that reality, forming a separate rhythm that no longer depended on rejoining what had already moved on. If you'd like to hear future stories like this, you can subscribe to the channel. As the understanding deepened that the world would not wait, the men began to feel a quieter shift beneath it, one that touched not events or timelines, but their sense of value within a world that continued without pause. Value had once been tied to position, role, or contribution, even when those roles were distant or interrupted, because interruption still implies return, and return had once felt possible. Now, as the world moved forward without acknowledging their absence, that sense of postponed value weakened, leaving behind a question that did not ask to be answered, only endured. The men did not feel worthless in a direct or dramatic sense, because worthlessness implies judgment, and no one was judging them, least of all the world that simply continued. What they felt instead was a thinning of relevance, a gradual sense that their existence no longer intersected with what was being built, decided, or concluded elsewhere. The world beyond the wire did not need them in order to function. And in realizing this, the men began to sense that usefulness was no longer something they could claim through waiting alone. Waiting, once understood as a temporary suspension of contribution, now felt disconnected from contribution entirely, because contribution had already taken place without them. This disconnection did not provoke bitterness, because bitterness requires belief in entitlement, and entitlement had eroded under long absence. Instead, it produced a quiet neutrality toward the idea of being needed, as though need itself had become something that belonged to another time. The men noticed that imagining themselves re-entering the world required an assumption that the world had left space for them, and that assumption no longer felt supported. Space had already been filled, routines re-established, paths redirected, leaving little room for the idea that return would restore alignment or purpose. Value, once imagined as something waiting to be resumed, now felt conditional, dependent on circumstances that no longer existed. The men did not attempt to redefine their worth actively, because redefining requires agency, and agency had already narrowed under prolonged containment. Instead, they adapted by lowering the importance of being relevant to what lay beyond the camp, redirecting attention toward maintaining stability within it. This redirection felt practical rather than defensive, because it reduced the strain of measuring themselves against a world that no longer mirrored their pace. The men found it easier to exist without assigning meaning to their position within the broader world, allowing value to settle into smaller, immediate forms. These forms were modest and internal, tied to endurance, routine, and presence rather than impact or recognition. The absence of external validation did not feel like deprivation, because deprivation assumes something withheld, and nothing had been withheld deliberately. The world had simply continued, and in doing so had removed itself as a reference point for self-assessment. Without that reference, Value no longer stretched outward toward achievement or return, contracting instead into the simple act of continuing. The men did not feel diminished as individuals, but they felt less connected to outcomes, as though outcomes no longer required their involvement. This separation softened ambition further, because ambition depends on the belief that effort aligns with movement, and movement had already carried on elsewhere. The men noticed that thinking about their place in the world felt less compelling than focusing on how to pass the day with minimal friction. Passing the day became its own measure, sufficient without comparison to what others were doing beyond the wire. This sufficiency did not feel fulfilling in a traditional sense, but it felt stable, and stability had become preferable to striving. The world's refusal to wait thus reshaped how value was experienced, shifting it from something external and deferred to something internal and immediate. The men adjusted by accepting that their worth would no longer be confirmed by rejoining the flow of events, because that flow no longer intersected with them. Acceptance arrived quietly, not as resignation, but as recalibration, a way of aligning self-perception with the reality of separation. They did not conclude that they no longer mattered, but they no longer assumed that matching required participation in a world that had already moved on. Value became less about impact and more about persistence, less about contribution and more about continuity. By the end of this phase, the realization that the world would not wait had transformed the men's sense of value, not by removing it, but by narrowing its scope, allowing life to continue without the need to be relevant to a movement that no longer slowed down for anyone, and preparing the ground for the next shift when even the desire to measure oneself against the outside world would begin to fade. As the men adjusted to a world that no longer waited and to a sense of value that no longer depended on return, identity itself began to change quietly, no longer stretching outward toward roles, futures, or recognition beyond the wire. Identity had once been shaped by movement, by belonging to something in progress, even when that progress was distant, because distance still allows for alignment. Now, with alignment broken, identity lost its outward tension, no longer pulled toward what was happening elsewhere. The men did not feel that they had lost who they were, because loss implies removal, and nothing had been removed deliberately. What changed instead was direction, as identity ceased to project itself forward into a world that no longer synchronized with their presence. The self began to fold inward, not as retreat, but as adaptation, reshaping itself around what could be sustained without reference to an outside pace. Roles that had once defined them faded in relevance, not because they were rejected, but because they no longer connected to daily experience. Being a soldier, a worker, a participant in a larger effort, all became descriptions that no longer matched the rhythm of life as it was now lived. The men noticed that introducing themselves in relation to the past required effort, because that past no longer interacted with the present. Identity grew quieter, less descriptive, and less tied to narrative, existing more as a condition than as a story. The absence of an audience contributed to this shift, because identity often forms in response to being seen, and the world beyond the wire was no longer watching. Without being seen in relation to events, the men no longer felt compelled to define themselves in ways that reached outward. This did not feel like invisibility, because invisibility implies presence unacknowledged, and here presence itself had narrowed. The men were present to one another and to the routines that shaped their days, and within that limited frame, identity stabilized. They became less concerned with who they had been and less curious about who they might become beyond the camp. The self adjusted to the scale of its environment, aligning with what could be maintained rather than what could be imagined. This adjustment reduced internal friction because identity no longer strained toward futures that did not align with reality. The men experienced a sense of continuity that did not depend on progress, where being remained sufficient without becoming. The world's refusal to wait thus reshaped identity by removing the expectation that it must remain in motion to remain valid. The men no longer felt pressure to preserve former versions of themselves for a return that no longer promised restoration. Those former selves existed, but they felt distant, belonging to a time when identity extended beyond the present enclosure. The men adapted by allowing identity to exist without ambition, grounded in presence rather than trajectory. This grounding felt steady, even if it felt limited, because limits had already become familiar. The absence of comparison with the outside world further softened identity, because comparison requires shared reference, and shared reference had been lost. The men found that thinking about themselves in absolute terms felt unnecessary, as relative positioning had already faded. Identity became less about distinction and more about continuity, less about role and more about endurance. They were no longer defined by what they contributed or by what they would rejoin, but by how they remained. This form of identity did not seek affirmation, because affirmation requires an external mirror, and the mirror of the world had turned away. Instead, identity settled into a quiet self-recognition that required no confirmation. The men did not articulate this change, because articulation implies audience and intent, and neither felt necessary. They lived as selves shaped by containment rather than by participation, aware that the world's movement no longer required their alignment. By the end of this phase, identity had fully adjusted to a reality where the world did not wait, no longer reaching outward to reclaim relevance or role, but existing inwardly, steady and contained, shaped by presence rather than progress, and prepared for the final shift, when even the need to define oneself would begin to loosen. As identity settled inward and no longer reached toward a world that would not wait, meaning itself began to loosen from the future, because meaning often depends on direction, and direction had already faded. The men noticed that purpose no longer arrived through anticipation, because anticipation assumes a moment ahead where effort will connect with outcome, and that connection no longer felt available. Meaning had once been carried forward by expectation, by the belief that endurance now would align with relevance later, even if later remained undefined. Now that belief weakened, not suddenly, but steadily, as the world beyond the wire continued to move without signaling that return would restore coherence. The men did not experience this as emptiness, because emptiness implies absence, and something remained, even as meaning changed shape. What changed was orientation. As meaning ceased to point outward toward events, futures, or reintegration, it instead settled closer to the present. The men found that asking why no longer produced urgency, because urgency depends on consequence, and consequence had already resolved elsewhere. Questions of purpose began to dissolve into routine, not because they were answered, but because they no longer influenced how the day unfolded. Meaning became quieter, less declarative, no longer tied to what might happen next, but to what could be sustained now. The men adapted by allowing significance to exist in smaller forms, detached from progression or recognition. These forms were subtle and internal, found in continuity rather than achievement, in persistence rather than direction. The world's refusal to wait removed the illusion that meaning required alignment with its movement, allowing meaning to exist without destination. The men noticed that they no longer framed their days as steps toward something, because steps imply a path, and the path had diverged. Days became complete in themselves, not as fulfillment, but as contained experiences that did not point beyond their boundaries. This containment reduced tension because striving toward a future that no longer aligned had already become exhausting. Meaning, once stretched across time, now compressed into the present, requiring less effort to maintain. The men did not celebrate this shift because celebration implies gain, and nothing had been gained, only adjusted. Nor did they resist it, because resistance requires belief that meaning must return to its former shape, and that belief had already softened. They experienced instead a neutral settling, where meaning existed without ambition, sufficient without expansion. The absence of forward pull altered emotional tone, flattening peaks and valleys into a steady, manageable range. The men found that they no longer evaluated their lives against imagined outcomes, because such evaluation required futures that no longer felt relevant. Meaning ceased to demand articulation, because articulation implies audience and projection, and neither felt necessary. It became something lived rather than explained, present without needing to justify itself. The world's movement elsewhere continued to confirm this adjustment, reinforcing that meaning need not travel to remain intact. The men allowed their sense of significance to exist without comparison, free from a need to align with what others were doing beyond the wire. This freedom was quiet and limited, but it reduced the strain of measuring oneself against a world that no longer slowed down, meaning no longer promised resolution or restoration, but it also no longer threatened collapse. It existed as a stable condition, shaped by acceptance rather than aspiration. The men lived within this condition without naming it, because naming implies intention to share, and sharing felt unnecessary. By the end of this phase, meaning had fully adjusted to a reality where the world would not wait, no longer pointing forward or outward, but settling into the present as something contained, sufficient, and undemanding, preparing the ground for the final stage, when even the need to hold meaning at all would begin to loosen, allowing existence to continue without reference to what had already moved on. As meaning settled fully into the present and no longer reached forward, the final change arrived quietly, not as a decision, but as a release that no longer required effort or explanation. The men did not wake one day and decide to let go of alignment with the world beyond the wire, because letting go implies intention, and intention had already thinned under long adjustment. What occurred instead was a gradual easing, as though something once held tightly had loosened on its own once it was no longer needed. The world continued to move, building, deciding, and reshaping itself elsewhere, and the men no longer felt the pull to follow it, because following requires belief that catching up remains possible. That belief had faded without resistance, leaving behind a quieter acceptance that their lives no longer needed to match the pace outside in order to remain coherent. Letting go did not feel like loss, because loss assumed something valued was taken away, and nothing had been taken, only passed beyond reach. Nor did it feel like surrender, because surrender requires opposition, and there was none, only distance maintained by time. The men experienced instead a soft detachment, a state in which the outside world existed without demanding emotional alignment or response. This detachment reduced inner strain, because striving to remain connected to a movement that would not slow down had already become unnecessary. The men no longer measured themselves against what they were missing, because missing implies absence of something expected, and expectation had already dissolved. They lived without anticipating reunion with the world as it was, because the world as it was no longer existed. What remained was a present that did not compete with elsewhere, allowing attention to rest where life actually unfolded. The men found that this rest made endurance easier because endurance no longer required justification through future relevance. Days passed without being framed as delays or interruptions, existing instead as complete units of experience. The men did not feel smaller for having let go, because scale had already adjusted to their environment, and adjustment had become familiar. Letting go felt less like an ending and more like alignment with reality as it now stood. The world's refusal to wait no longer provoked reflection, because reflection requires friction, and friction had softened into acceptance. The men existed without asking when things would reconnect, because reconnection was no longer assumed. This absence of assumption allowed emotional energy to settle, reducing fluctuation and stabilizing inner life. The men did not become indifferent, but they became unburdened, free from a need to remain synchronized with a timeline that had already moved past them. The outside world continued to exist fully, and the men continued to exist fully within their own narrowed frame, without one invalidating the other. Letting go, thus, completed the transition from waiting to inhabiting, from expecting to continuing, from alignment to acceptance. The men no longer positioned themselves as temporarily out of place, but as present where they were, without expectation of return to a previous rhythm. This presence did not feel triumphant or tragic, because both require contrast, and contrast had already faded. What remained was a steady way of being, shaped by the understanding that life continues wherever it can, even when paths diverge. By the end of this phase, the men had fully adapted to a world that would not wait, not by resisting or lamenting its movement, but by releasing the need to follow it, allowing their lives to continue without reference to a pace that no longer belonged to them, and bringing the transition to a quiet completion, ready to close without force or finality. In the end, nothing dramatic marked the moment when the world fully moved on, because it had never stopped to announce itself in the first place. Life continued elsewhere, reshaping itself without pause, while those left behind learned to exist without expecting time to slow down or turn back. What once felt like waiting gradually became simply living, no longer measured against return, relevance, or alignment. And so the world kept moving, and they remained where they were, not in opposition to time, but quietly outside its urgency, allowing life to continue without asking it to wait. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.